Welcome to Vintage Stories, where we unearth the chilling and dark tales buried deep in America's history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for weekly dives into the forgotten past. Get ready for a journey back in time, where questions go unanswered and secrets that shape the nation remain buried in the shadows. There are questions that should never be asked aloud, questions whose answers lie buried beneath decades of silence, locked away behind closed doors and burned letters. Questions that, once spoken, unravel entire lives like thread pulled from rotting fabric. In the spring of 1847, a young enslaved woman named Danina asked such a question. She whispered it only once, her voice barely rising above a whisper, as she stood in the doorway of the plantation house kitchen. The man she asked, the overseer, a brutal figure named Horace Vance, was found 3 days later hanging from the oak tree behind the stables. His own belt wrapped around his neck, his face frozen in an expression that witnesses would later describe as knowing. But Danina's question didn't die with Vance. It spread through the quarters like fever, whispered in the tobacco fields and murmured over cooking fires. As it spread, other long-hidden secrets began to surface, secrets that had been carefully kept for nearly 2 decades. Secrets that involved the master's family, the bloodlines of the plantation, and a truth so disturbing that it would eventually consume everyone who touched it. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation in Londonderry County, Virginia, where a simple question about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror far worse than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of Thornhill Plantation, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, buried deep in America's darkest history, are what we uncover here every week. I want to know where you're listening from. Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's discover what Danina saw that spring morning and why her question could never be answered safely. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's rolling Piedmont. The main house was a 3-story Georgian structure with gleaming white columns that shimmered under the afternoon sun. The estate rested on land that had once been hunting grounds for the Saponi people, who were pushed westward by colonial expansion. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild purchased the property, with wealth made from the tobacco trade, no trace of the original inhabitants remained, except for the occasional arrowhead that turned up in the plow. The Fairchild family had owned the plantation for nearly 50 years when our story begins. Colonel James had built the grand house in 1802, hiring craftsmen from Richmond to create a structure that would announce the family's power to anyone who passed. The house boasted a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase, parlors on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room that could seat 20, and 6 bedrooms upstairs that overlooked the tobacco fields stretching toward the river. Behind the main house stood the dependencies, the kitchen house, separate to reduce fire risk, the smokehouse, where meat was cured, the dairy with its cool stone floor, the laundry, where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs, the carriage house and stables, and the overseer's cottage. Beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, were the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, Edward's father, also named James. This second James Fairchild ran Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 from what the doctor called apoplexy, a stroke that took him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning at just 41 years old. Edward Fairchild, then just 28, inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings listed in the estate inventory between the livestock and the furniture. He had been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had 1 infant daughter who tragically died of scarlet fever before her 2nd birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 years old and looked older. His hair, once dark brown, had turned mostly gray. His face had the weathered quality of a man who spent his days outdoors inspecting fields and checking accounts. He was not a tall man, perhaps 5'9", but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone conscious of his authority. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain lights, and they rarely showed emotion. Catherine had died in 1838, giving birth to their only surviving child, a boy named Thomas. The birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had bled too much afterward. The doctor from town did what he could, but infection set in. She lasted a week, feverish and delirious, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand in silence. When she finally died, he had her buried in the family cemetery behind the house, beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9 years old, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's delicate features. He was being educated by a tutor from Richmond, a stern Presbyterian named Mr. Gaines who believed in Latin, mathematics, and the rod. The boy showed aptitude for learning but little enthusiasm. He spent his free hours reading in the library or wandering the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 souls. That spring of 1847, the number fluctuated, with births and deaths, occasional sales and purchases, but it had remained close to 50 for the past 15 years. Most worked the tobacco fields that stretched from the main house to the river. Their days were measured by the sun's arc and the overseer's watch. Tobacco was demanding. It required constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September. Even in winter, there was work to be done, stripping leaves, preparing beds for the next year's crop, repairing equipment. Others worked in the house, the stables, the smithy, and the kitchen. There was a hierarchy among the enslaved people, as there always was. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled craftsmen held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt superior to those purchased from elsewhere. But these distinctions meant little in the end. They were all property, all subject to the same absolute power, all vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. Danina was 19 years old that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Danina was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a chambermaid, responsible for cleaning the bedrooms, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the personal needs of the family. She had been a quiet woman, Danina remembered, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had secretly taught Danina to read, using a Bible she'd somehow acquired, and had told her stories about her own mother, who had been brought from Africa as a child, and whose memories of the ocean crossing haunted her entire life. Ruth had died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that killed 6 people on the plantation. Danina, then just 12, had nursed her mother through the final days, wiping her burning forehead with cool cloths, giving her sips of water, and listening to her delirious ramblings. In those final hours, Ruth had said things that made no sense to the child Danina. Apologies, warnings, names that meant nothing. She had gripped Danina's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Danina hadn't understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Danina was moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60 years old, but she was strong in both body and spirit. A woman who had seen the worst of the world, and yet held on to a certain fire. She didn't know exactly how old she was. Enslaved people rarely knew their true ages. But Dina knew one thing for sure: Bess was the closest thing to a mother she had after Ruth's death. With her gray hair wrapped in a cloth, and hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts, Bess was a seasoned woman, toughened by years of hardship. She had taught Dina everything: how to cook, manage the kitchen, and navigate the perilous waters of serving white people who could lash out at the slightest offense. Dina was quiet, quick with her hands, and possessed an uncanny ability to observe everything around her, a trait that would be both a gift and a curse. She noticed things: the way Edward Fairchild's jaw tightened when he was angry, how Mr. Gaines's eyes lingered on the younger enslaved women, and the way Horace Vance seemed to take pleasure in watching others fear. Dina had learned to observe people, to see the patterns, the connections, the hints of secrets that no one dared speak aloud. She had a brother, Samuel, 2 years younger. Samuel had worked in the stables since he was a child, and his unusual appearance had always set him apart. while most enslaved people at Thornhill bore the deep brown skin of their West African ancestors. Samuel's complexion was noticeably lighter, sometimes referred to as bright or cruelly yellow. His features were also different: narrow nose, thin lips, and those pale gray eyes that marked the Fairchild bloodline. Mixed race children, like Samuel, were common on plantations across the South, though no one spoke of them openly. Their existence was an uncomfortable reminder of the violent system that enslaved them, and the silence surrounding their presence was deliberate, crafted by fear and denial. Masters never acknowledged their children, white wives pretended not to notice, and enslaved people learned to keep silent, knowing that speaking the truth could lead to being sold away or worse. But Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family couldn't be ignored. As he grew, it became undeniable. He had Edward's tall, lean build, broad shoulders, and long limbs. He had Edward's way of tilting his head when listening, as if considering every word from different angles. By 1847, at 17, Samuel looked like he could have been Edward's son. And, of course, he was. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved people had known since Samuel was a child. They had witnessed Ruth's silence, her shame. They understood that Ruth had been young and pretty when the old master, Edward's father, took notice of her. They knew she had no choice. No was not a word enslaved women could say to white men. Samuel was the result. He had been the burden Ruth carried, and it was that burden that ultimately killed her. Even the white workers, the overseer, and the tutor, everyone must have noticed. How could they not? Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was written on his face, in his body, in his movements. But knowing and speaking the truth were two different things. The plantation system thrived on silence. As long as the truth was unspoken, the fiction could endure. Edward could remain master. Samuel could remain property. And the lie, that blood didn't matter, that family didn't matter, that a man could own his own brother, could continue, until Dina asked her question. The morning of April 23, 1847, began like any other. Dina rose before dawn in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women: Mary, who worked in the laundry; Patience, who worked in the fields; and Aunt Sarah, who was too old for heavy work now and spent her days mending clothes and watching children. The cabin was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper. There were 2 narrow beds with rough wooden frames and straw mattresses, and a fireplace where they cooked their own meals when they had time. Dina dressed quickly, pulling on the same brown, homespun cotton dress she wore every day, mended in a dozen places. She wrapped her hair in a cloth, slipped her feet into worn shoes, and made her way through the pre-dawn darkness to the kitchen house. The path from the quarters to the kitchen was well worn, the earth pressed down by the feet of hundreds of people who had walked it 1,000 times. The air was cool and damp, filled with the smell of earth and growing things. Spring had come early that year, and the trees were already fully leafed, their dark branches outlined against the dim sky. Birds, mockingbirds, cardinals, and the caw of crows had already begun their calls. Bess was already in the kitchen when Dinah arrived, as she always was. The older woman seemed to need less sleep as the years passed, waking earlier and earlier, as though trying to stretch the time left in her life. Bess had already built up the fire in the great hearth, and the kitchen was warming. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the lingering scent of yesterday's cooking. "Morning, child," Bess said, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Morning, Aunt Bess." Dina moved quietly beside her. They worked in silence as they did every morning. Bess kneaded bread, while Dina fetched water from the well, filled the kettle, hung it over the fire to heat, brought in eggs from the hen house, and sliced ham from the joint hanging in the smokehouse. The kitchen was a separate building about 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was built of brick with a slate roof to contain any fires. The main room held the enormous fireplace with hooks and cranes, a long worktable, shelves of dishes and pots, barrels of flour and cornmeal, strings of onions and dried peppers hanging from the rafters. By 60 they were preparing breakfast to carry to the main house: biscuits, ham, eggs, coffee, preserves made from last summer's peaches, Young Thomas took his breakfast at 70 Oded sharp in the dining room with his tutor, Mr. Gaines. Edward ate later, around 80 Ode, while reviewing the plantation's accounts. The routine was set, had been the same for years. Dinah could perform her tasks in her sleep. But that morning, her mind wandered. She was thinking about Samuel. Her brother had gotten into trouble again. 2 days ago, he'd been caught near the main house after dark, where enslaved people had no business being after work hours. He claimed he was looking for a lost tool, but Horace Vance didn't believe him, or didn't care. The overseer announced that Samuel would receive 10 lashes as punishment, to be administered that afternoon in front of the other enslaved people as a lesson. 10 lashes. Dinah had seen whippings before, heard the crack of the whip, seen the bloody stripes left on backs. 10 lashes wasn't the worst. Some people received 50, even 100. Beatings that left them unable to work for days. But 10 lashes were enough to scar, enough to hurt, enough to humiliate. And for what? For walking near the house that his own father owned. For existing in a space where his presence reminded everyone of the truth they all pretended not to know. At 8C Hodard. Dinah was carrying a tray of fresh biscuits from the kitchen to the main house when she encountered Horace Vance on the path. Vance was a thick, bodied man of about 50, with a perpetually red face from drink and sun. He wore rough work clothes and a short whip coiled at his belt. "Morning, Dinah," he said, his voice laced with a false friendliness that was worse than outright hostility. "Morning, Mr. Vance." She kept her eyes down as she was expected. He reached out, took a biscuit without asking, and chewed slowly, crumbs catching in his beard. He stood close enough that she could smell him. Sweat, tobacco, something sour. "Your brother's getting his lashes this afternoon. 30 Hoded by the tobacco sheds. You'll be there to watch, I expect." It wasn't a question. When punishment was administered, it was part of the lesson. "Yes, sir," Dinah said quietly. "Good." He took another bite. Boy needs to learn his place. Getting too big for his britches. Thinking he can wander where he pleases. Can't have that. Got to maintain order. You understand? "Yes, sir." Your mama understood that. Ruth knew her place, knew how things worked. You do well to be like her. He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Pretty girl like you, smart girl. You could do well here if you keep your head down and your mouth shut." The implication was clear, and it made Dinah's stomach turn. She said nothing, just stood there, waiting for him to move. Finally Vance stepped aside. "Better get those biscuits to the house before they get cold. Master Edward don't like cold biscuits." Dinah hurried past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She entered through the back door into the warming kitchen, a small room where food was kept hot before serving. From there, a narrow hallway led past the butler's pantry to the dining room. As she approached with the tray, she heard voices, Thomas and his tutor, Mr. Gaines. The dining room door stood slightly ajar. Dinah paused, not out of curiosity, but from training. Servants learned to pause before entering rooms, to listen, to gauge the mood, and to avoid interrupting at the wrong time. Through the gap, she saw Thomas seated at the long mahogany table, his Latin primer open before him. Again, Mr. Gaines was saying, the conjugation first person singular present tense. Thomas's voice was hesitant. "Amo," louder. "Speak with confidence." "Amo. Amet." The morning light fell across Thomas's face, illuminating his profile, the sharp nose, pale eyes, thin mouth, and the way his hair fell across his forehead. He wore a white shirt with a stiff collar, dark trousers, and polished shoes, a child dressed as a small adult, being molded into the master he would become. In that moment, Dinah thought of Samuel, her brother, probably mucking out the stalls in the stables, his hands rough and callosed, his clothes stained with manure and sweat. Samuel, who would be whipped that afternoon for walking near the house that his own father owned. Samuel, who had the same pale gray eyes as the boy at the table, the same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head. The resemblance was undeniable. They could have been brothers. They were brothers, half-brothers, sharing a grandfather, sharing Fairchild blood. One sat at a mahogany table, learning Latin, destined to inherit land, wealth, and power. The other cleaned stables, whipped for walking in the wrong place. The anger came suddenly. Unexpectedly, a hot surge rising from her chest to her throat. It wasn't planned, not a calculated risk. It was the breaking point after years of accumulated silence. Years of watching her mother's sadness. Years of seeing Samuel treated as property, while bearing the face of the family that owned him. Years of swallowing truths that everyone knew but no one dared to speak. Danina pushed open the door, carrying the tray. Mr. Gaines glanced at her with the blank expression reserved for servants, seeing her function, but not her face. He acknowledged her presence the way one would acknowledge a piece of furniture that had moved. Thomas didn't look up from his book, still focused on his Latin conjugations. Danina placed the tray on the sideboard, then began arranging the biscuits on a serving plate. Her hands shook slightly, but she tried to control them. The anger was still there, simmering, demanding release. And then, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, she said, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room fell silent. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse, impossible to ignore. Danina continued to arrange the biscuits, her hands moving automatically, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone must hear it. Mr. Gaines turned slowly. His face went pale, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, barely controlled. Danina didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The question had been heard. It had been understood. Now it existed in the world, real, undeniable. Thomas looked up from his Latin primer, his young face confused. "Which brother?" he asked with the innocent directness of a 9-year-old who didn't understand why this question was forbidden. "Who does she mean?" "I didn't know she had a brother." "Mr." Gaines's face turned from pale to red. He took a step toward Danina, one hand raised, but then seemed to think better of it. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling beneath his black suit. "Get out," he said quietly. "Get out now." Danina left the tray, left the biscuits half arranged, and walked out. She crossed the hallway, moved through the warming kitchen, and out the back door. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, like she was watching herself from a distance. She crossed the yard to the kitchen house, closing the door behind her. Bess was at the work table, rolling dough for pies. She glanced at Danina's face and set down her rolling pin. "Child, what did you do?" Danina couldn't answer. She sat on the back step of the kitchen, waiting for the consequences to arrive. Her hands still shook. She clasped them tightly in her lap and stared at them. The brown skin, the calloused palms, the hands that looked like her mother's. What had she done? She had spoken the truth. That was all. She had asked a simple question, pointed out a simple fact. "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" But she knew, deep down, that nothing about it was simple. She had violated the most sacred rule. She had named what must never be named. She had torn away the veil of silence that allowed the system to function. And now she would pay the price. Bess sat beside her on the step, not saying anything, just offering her presence as comfort. They waited in silence, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up, voices calling, tools clanging, the distant lowing of cattle. After what felt like an eternity, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on the path. Danina knew who it was before she looked up. Horace Vance appeared at the kitchen door, his face flushed, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of anger and excitement. He was breathing hard, as if he had been running. "You," he said, pointing at Danina. "Come with me now." Bess stood quickly. "Mr. Vance, sir. She didn't mean no harm. She's just a foolish girl who don't know when to keep quiet." I said, "Come with me." Vance's hand moved to the whip at his belt, his fingers caressing the coiled leather. Danina stood, her legs steadier now, her mind clearer. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no point in resisting, no point in running. She had nowhere to run to. She followed Vance out of the kitchen, leaving Bess standing in the doorway, her face stricken. They walked not toward the whipping post near the tobacco sheds, as Danina had expected, but toward the grand house. Vance led her around to the front entrance, a place enslaved people were never meant to use, and up the steps to the porch with its white columns. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with brass fittings. Vance opened it without knocking and pushed Danina inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool, a stark contrast to the brightness of the morning sun outside. Danina had been in this space before, of course, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving quickly through, performing her duties. Now, being marched through by the overseer, she felt exposed, wrong, like a piece of furniture moved to the wrong place. The hall was grand, a black and white checkered marble floor, a curving staircase with an ornate banister, a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. Portraits of Fairchild ancestors adorned the walls. To the left was the parlor, to the right the library, and straight ahead, past the staircase, was the door to Edward Fairchild's study. Vance knocked sharply at that door. Enter. The study was large, lined with books, dominated by a massive dark wood desk. Edward sat behind it, his hands folded on the leather surface, his expression unreadable. Mr. Gaines stood to one side, his face still pale, his hands clasped in front of him. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and old paper. Vance pushed Danina forward, positioning her in front of the desk like a prisoner before a judge. "This is the one, sir," Vance said. "The one who spoke out of turn this morning." Edward studied Danina for a long moment, his pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, showing no emotion. His face was calm, but his jaw was tight, and the tension in his shoulders suggested controlled fury. "Repeat what you said," Edward commanded. His voice was level, quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Danina's mouth was dry. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her tongue felt thick, useless. "I said," Edward repeated. "Repeated." Danina's voice came out in a whisper. She swallowed and tried again. "I asked why young master looks like my brother." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Vance seemed to hold his breath. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Edward's voice cut through the silence, cold and quiet. "Which brother?" "Samuel, sir." "Samuel, who works in the stables." Edward's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, or perhaps resignation. He looked at Mr. Gaines. "You heard this?" "I did." "Sir." "In front of young Master Thomas." The boy asked questions. He wanted to know who she meant. Said he didn't know she had a brother. Edward nodded slowly. His gaze remained steady, cold. "And what did you hope to accomplish with this question? What did you think would happen?" Danina didn't answer. She hadn't planned anything. She hadn't thought about consequences. She had simply spoken. "Do you understand what you've done?" Edward continued. "Do you understand that you've disrupted the order of this household? That you've planted ideas in my son's mind that he's too young to comprehend? That you've violated every rule of proper conduct?" Still, Danina said nothing. What could she say? That the question had burned inside her for years. That she was tired of the lie. That she wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge the truth. Edward stood, walked around the desk, and approached her. He wasn't a tall man, but in this moment he seemed to tower over her. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the tightness of his mouth. "Your mother knew her place," he said quietly. "Ruth understood how things worked. She never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. She accepted her lot and lived her life accordingly." He paused. "You would do well to follow her example." The mention of her mother sparked something in Danina. "My mother died sad and silent," she said, her voice stronger now. "She carried secrets that ate her from the inside. Is that what you want? More silence? More secrets?" Edward's hand moved so fast, Danina didn't see it coming. The slap caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side, making her ears ring. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "You will not speak to me in that tone," Edward said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "You will not question me. You are property. You exist at my sufferance. Do you understand?" Danina stood silently, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Edward turned to Vance. "Take her to the root cellar. Lock her in. I'll decide her punishment later." As Vance grabbed Danina's arm and pulled her toward the door, Edward added, "And bring Samuel to me?" "Mr. Porter," Jacob said tentatively. "You all right, sir?" Porter turned to look at him, and Jacob took an involuntary step back. The overseer's face was wrong somehow. Not injured, not marked, but wrong. As if he'd aged 10 years in a single night. The tree, Porter whispered. The oak tree. He's still there, still hanging, still watching. Ain't nobody there, Mr. Porter. Vance is buried, I saw him. Porter's voice rose to a shout. I saw him hanging there. His face. He couldn't continue. He pushed past Jacob and ran from the stable. By noon, Porter had packed his belongings and left Thornhill, refusing to explain, refusing to stay even one more night. He rode away on his horse, looking back over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Edward tried to convince him to stay, offered him more money, but Porter wouldn't even discuss it. There's something wrong with this place, he said. Something evil. I won't stay here. I won't end up like Vance. And he was gone. Edward hired a third overseer, a hard man from North Carolina named Garrett, and warned him about the foolish superstitions among the enslaved people. Garrett laughed and said he didn't believe in ghosts. He'd been managing slaves for 20 years, he said, and he'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained by natural causes. He lasted 2 weeks. On his final night at Thornhill, Garrett was found at dawn wandering the tobacco fields, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding, his face scratched as though he'd been running through brambles. He was muttering to himself, his words barely coherent. The boy, he kept saying. The boy in the stables, the eyes, the same eyes, he knows. He knows what was done. He knows. They brought him to the house, tried to calm him, tried to get him to explain what had happened, but Garrett couldn't or wouldn't say. He just kept muttering about eyes and knowing and the boy in the stables. By midday, he had recovered enough to pack his things. He left that afternoon without collecting his wages, without saying goodbye, without looking back. After that, Edward couldn't find anyone willing to serve as overseer. Word had spread through the county. Thornhill Plantation was cursed, haunted, wrong. 3 overseers in less than a month, 1 dead, 2 driven away by something they couldn't or wouldn't name. No amount of money was worth that risk. The enslaved people, left largely unsupervised, continued their work out of habit and fear. They knew that if the plantation failed, they would be sold away, families separated, lives destroyed. So, they worked the fields, tended the animals, maintained the buildings, kept the routines going. But the discipline that had once ruled Thornhill had collapsed. Without an overseer, without constant supervision, the rigid structure began to crack, and Thomas Fairchild, now 10 years old, had begun asking questions. The questions started innocently enough. Thomas asked Bess, the cook, about the boy who used to work in the stables. He asked old Jacob where Samuel had gone. He asked the other enslaved people if they knew anything about his mother's family, about his grandfather, about the history of the plantation. Most of them deflected his questions, gave vague answers, tried to avoid engaging with the boy. But Thomas was persistent. He had inherited his father's intelligence and his father's stubbornness. And Dinah's question had planted a seed in his mind that wouldn't stop growing. He came to the kitchen often, always when Bess was elsewhere, always seeking out Dinah. At first, she tried to avoid him, afraid of what might happen if she was caught speaking to the master's son. But Thomas was insistent, and gradually, carefully, she began to tell him things. Not everything, not the full truth that Edward had revealed to her in his study, but pieces of it, fragments that a 10-year-old mind could grasp. She told him about Samuel, about how kind he'd been, how he'd carved little animals from wood and given them to the younger children in the quarters. She told him about their mother Ruth, who had died of fever, who had been gentle and sad. She told him in careful language that sometimes masters had children with enslaved women, and those children were born into slavery despite their parentage. Thomas listened with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. He asked questions that showed he understood more than he should. But if a master has a child with a slave woman, isn't that child his son or daughter? Doesn't that make them family? By blood? Yes, Dinah said carefully, but not by law. The law says the child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is enslaved no matter who the father is. But that's not fair. No, young master, it's not fair. And Samuel, he was your brother. Your full brother. Yes, and he looked like me. Dinah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he looked like you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young face troubled. Why did he look like me? This was the dangerous question, the one Dinah couldn't answer directly. You'd have to ask your father that, young master. I did ask him. He won't tell me. He says I'm too young to understand, that I shouldn't concern myself with such matters. Thomas looked at her with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes. But I do understand. I understand that Samuel was my uncle, that he was my grandfather's son, that he was family, and father sold him. Anyway, Dinah said nothing. What could she say? The boy had worked it out himself, had put the pieces together. He was 10 years old, and he understood the fundamental horror at the heart of his world. It's wrong, Thomas said quietly. It's wrong. Yes, Dinah agreed. It's wrong. And slowly, over the course of those summer conversations, Dinah watched something change in the boy's face. The innocence was leaving him, being replaced by a knowledge that no child should have to carry. He was beginning to understand what he was part of, what his family had done, what his very existence meant. He was beginning to understand that he was both victim and beneficiary of a system built on lies and violence. That his comfort came at the cost of others' suffering. That his inheritance was built on stolen lives and broken families. And that knowledge was destroying him. On the night of August 27th, Thomas Fairchild disappeared. Edward discovered it at breakfast when the boy didn't appear. Thomas was usually punctual, appearing in the dining room at 7. Hodred sharp as Mr. Gaines had trained him. When he didn't come down, Edward sent a house servant to check on him. The servant returned with troubling news. Thomas's bed was unslept in. His window was open, and the boy was nowhere to be found. Edward's reaction was immediate and frantic. He gathered every enslaved person on the plantation, lined them up in front of the main house, and demanded to know if anyone had seen Thomas. His voice, usually so controlled, was ragged with fear. If anyone knows where my son is, speak now. If anyone has helped him, hidden him, hurt him, speak now, and your punishment will be less severe than if I discover it later. No one spoke. No one knew anything. The enslaved people looked at each other, confused and frightened. Thomas had disappeared, and no one had seen or heard anything. Edward sent riders to neighboring plantations, to the town of Londonburg, to the river crossings. He offered a reward for information, a 50 dah, an enormous sum. He questioned everyone again individually this time, but no one knew anything. Days passed. The search expanded to cover the entire county. Neighbors joined in, organizing search parties to comb the woods and fields. The sheriff returned, bringing deputies, searching for any sign of the missing boy. But Thomas had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. Edward was beside himself. He didn't sleep, barely ate. Spent his days and nights searching, calling his son's name, offering prayers to a God he'd never particularly believed in. The plantation's work came to a halt as everyone focused on finding the missing boy. On the third day, Dinah came to Edward's study. She knocked on the door, waited for permission to enter, and stepped inside. Edward looked up from his desk, his face haggard, his eyes red from sleeplessness. What is it? His voice was hoarse. I know where he is, Dinah said. Edward stood up so quickly his chair fell over backward. Where? The old slave cemetery, past the tobacco fields near the woods. Edward stared at her. Why would he be there? Because I told him about it. About the people buried there. About... She hesitated. About his grandmother, Ruth. Edward's face went white. You told him. He asked about Samuel's mother. I told him the truth. I told him where she was buried. For a moment, Dinah thought Edward might strike her again. His hand clenched into a fist. His whole body tensed. But then he seemed to deflate, all the anger draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and despair. Show me, he said quietly. They walked together through the tobacco fields, past the worksheds into the woods. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows. Birds sang in the branches overhead, oblivious to human drama. The old slave cemetery was perhaps a quarter-mile into the woods in a small clearing. It was where the enslaved people buried their dead, away from the white cemetery near the main house. The graves were marked by rough wooden crosses and field stones, most of them weathered and leaning. The names were remembered only in the memories of the living, passed down through oral tradition, because enslaved people weren't allowed headstones with inscriptions. They found Thomas sitting beside one of the graves, his back against a tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He'd been there for 3 days, apparently, sleeping in the woods, drinking from the creek, eating nothing. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face scratched from branches, his lips cracked from thirst. When he saw Edward, he didn't move. He just looked at his father with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, Edward's eyes, and said, "She's buried here. Ruth, my grandmother." Edward stopped several paces away, as though afraid to come closer. "Thomas, you need to come home." "Why?" The boy's voice was flat, emotionless. "So I can pretend I don't know. So I can grow up and own my own cousins and half-siblings and pretend it's normal." Thomas stood up, his small frame shaking. "My uncle and my half-brother. Both. And you sold him. You sold your own son, your own brother's son, and you didn't even care. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Thomas's voice rose to a shout, echoing through the trees. "It's exactly that simple. You did it. Grandfather did it. And now I'm supposed to do it too, aren't I? That's what you're teaching me. That's what all of this is for. So I can grow up and do the same things. Own people, sell people, pretend they're not human." Edward took a step forward. "You don't understand. You're too young to understand how the world works. I understand that it's wrong." Thomas was crying now, his words coming in gasps. "I understand that we're monsters. That our whole family is built on being monsters. That everything we have, everything we are is built on hurting people and pretending it's normal." Edward reached for his son, but Thomas jerked away. "Don't touch me. You're not my father. You're just a man who owns people, who owns his own children, who sold his own brother." The boy turned and ran, not toward the house, but deeper into the woods. Edward called after him, but Thomas didn't stop, didn't look back. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Edward standing alone among the graves. Dina, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a few paces back, said quietly, "Let him go. He'll come back when he's ready." Edward turned on her, his face twisted with rage and grief. "This is your fault, this. You destroyed my son with your questions and your truths." Nuna interrupted, her voice steady. "You destroyed him. You and your father and all the men like you. You built a world on lies and violence, and now your son can see it for what it is. I didn't do that. I just made him see what was already there." Edward raised his hand as if to strike her, then let it fall. He looked suddenly old, defeated, broken. The master of Thornhill Plantation, who had controlled so much, who had wielded such power, stood among the graves of the people his family had owned, and looked like a man who had lost everything. "Get back to the house," he said quietly. Dina turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone among the unmarked graves, calling his son's name into the indifferent woods. Thomas returned to the house that evening, silent and hollow-eyed. He went to his room and locked the door. Edward tried to speak with him, standing in the hallway, pleading through the locked door, but the boy wouldn't answer. The next morning, Thomas emerged and resumed his daily routine, as though nothing had happened. But something fundamental had broken in him. He moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, his face expressionless. He ate his meals in silence, did his lessons mechanically, spent his free time alone in his room. Edward watched his son with growing desperation. He tried to explain, to justify, to make Thomas understand the necessities of their world. He talked about economics, about the way society was structured, about how slavery was legal and accepted, and had existed for thousands of years. He talked about duty and inheritance, and the responsibilities of their class. But Thomas wouldn't listen. He had seen the truth and he couldn't unsee it. He had understood the horror and he couldn't unknow it. In September, Edward made a decision. He would send Thomas away to boarding school in Richmond, away from Thornhill and its ghosts, away from Dina and her dangerous truths, away from the graves in the woods and the questions they raised. Perhaps distance would heal what had been broken. Perhaps Thomas would forget, would learn to accept the world as it was, would grow into the master he was meant to be. But before he could make the arrangements, something happened that would make all such plans irrelevant. September brought cooler weather to Virginia, the first hints of autumn in the air. The tobacco harvest was underway, the enslaved people working long days to bring in the crop before the first frost. The leaves were cut, hung in the curing barns, tended carefully to ensure they dried properly. It was the most important time of the year, the work that would determine whether the plantation made money or lost it. But the work was proceeding slowly, inefficiently, without proper supervision. Edward tried to manage it himself, but he was no overseer. He didn't know the details of the work, didn't know how to drive people to maximum productivity, didn't have the presence or the brutality to command absolute obedience. The enslaved people worked, but at their own pace. They took breaks when they needed them, helped each other, looked after the elderly and the children without constant supervision, without the threat of immediate punishment. They created their own rhythms, their own systems. The work got done, but not as quickly or as efficiently as it would have under Vance's brutal management. Edward watched this with growing frustration, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. He couldn't find anyone willing to serve as overseer. He couldn't manage the work himself, and he couldn't sell everyone and start over. That would destroy the plantation's value, leave him with nothing. He was trapped, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his strange, silent existence. He went through the motions of daily life, but seemed disconnected from everything around him. He did his lessons with the new tutor, a timid young man from Lynchburg, who lasted exactly 3 weeks before departing, claiming the atmosphere at Thornhill was oppressive, but showed no interest in learning. He ate his meals but tasted nothing. He slept, but had nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. And he continued to seek out Dina, continued to ask questions, continued to try to understand the incomprehensible. One afternoon in mid-September, Thomas found Dina in the kitchen garden picking vegetables for dinner. Bess was inside, and they were alone. Thomas sat down on the ground beside her, watching her work. "I've been thinking," he said after a long silence, "about what you said about how the law says children follow the condition of the mother." Dina continued picking beans, dropping them into her basket. "Yes, young master. So if a free woman has a child with an enslaved man, the child is free." "Yes. But if an enslaved woman has a child with a free man, the child is enslaved." "Yes." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "That's designed to benefit the masters, isn't it? So they can have children with enslaved women and not have to free them. So they can increase their property." Dina looked at him, surprised by his insight. "Yes, that's exactly what it's designed to do. And my grandfather, he had children with enslaved women. With your mother, with others." This was dangerous territory, but Dina decided to answer honestly. "Yes, Ruth was not the only one. So I have uncles and aunts who are enslaved, cousins, half-siblings, maybe." "Yes." Thomas picked up a stick and began drawing patterns in the dirt. "And father knows this." "Yes, and he doesn't care." Dina chose her words carefully. "I think he cares. I think it troubles him. But he doesn't know what to do about it. The system is bigger than any one person. Your father didn't create it. He just inherited it. Like he inherited this plantation. But he could change it. He could free people. He could acknowledge his family. He could. But it would cost him everything. His wealth, his status, his place in society, and it wouldn't change the system. Other plantations would still exist. Other enslaved people would still suffer. Your father freeing his slaves wouldn't end slavery." Thomas threw the stick away. "So, we're all trapped. The enslaved people are trapped because they're property. And we're trapped because we benefit from owning them. And we can't give that up without losing everything," Dina said quietly. "It's exactly right." "It's evil," Thomas said. "The whole thing is evil." "Yes." They sat in silence for a while, Dina picking vegetables, Thomas staring at nothing. Finally, the boy said, "What happened to Samuel? Where did they send him?" "South, that's all I know. The trader was heading to Mississippi or Alabama to the cotton plantations." "I see. Will he be all right?" Dina didn't answer immediately. How could she? The cotton plantations were notorious for their brutality, for working enslaved people to death and replacing them with new purchases. Samuel was young and strong, which might help him survive. But he was also light-skinned, educated, marked by his resemblance to the family that had owned him. That might make things harder. I don't know, she finally said. I hope so. I pray so, but I don't know. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he said something that chilled Dina to her core. I wish I'd never been born. I wish I didn't exist because my existence is part of this. I'm part of the evil. Young master, it's true. I benefit from it. I eat food grown by enslaved people. I wear clothes made by enslaved people. I live in a house built by enslaved people. Everything I have, everything I am is built on their suffering. And someday I'm supposed to inherit all of this, supposed to become the master, supposed to continue it. He looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. I don't want to. I don't want any of it. I'd rather die than become what my father is, what my grandfather was. Don't say that, Dina said urgently. You're young. You can choose differently. You can be different. Can I? Or am I already too corrupted, already too much a part of it? Dina didn't have an answer for that. She just continued picking vegetables, and Thomas sat beside her in silence. Both of them trapped in a system neither had created but both were part of. That night, Edward Fairchild sat in his study drinking whiskey and going through Horace Vance's personal effects. After the overseer's death, his belongings had been packed up and stored in a trunk in the attic. Edward had finally decided to go through them looking for what he didn't know. Answers, maybe. Understanding. The trunk contained the usual things: clothes, a razor, a pipe, some money. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, Edward found a small leather journal. He opened it and began to read. The journal was Vance's private record, kept over many years. It contained notes about the plantation's operations, observations about the enslaved people, records of punishments administered. But it also contained something else, a careful accounting of bloodlines. Vance had kept track of which enslaved children had been fathered by which white men. He had noted resemblances, recorded births, tracked family connections, and he had paid particular attention to the children of the old master, Edward's father. As Edward read, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. Samuel was not the only child his father had sired with enslaved women. There had been others, many others. Over the course of 30 years, the old master had fathered at least a dozen children with enslaved women on the plantation. Some had died young. Some had been sold away, but several were still at Thornhill, working in the fields, living in the quarters, bearing the Fairchild blood in their veins. Edward recognized some of the names: Peter, who worked in the smithy, he was Edward's half-brother. Mary, who worked in the laundry, she was Edward's half-sister. Jacob, the old man who tended the horses, he was Edward's half-brother, older than Edward himself. The plantation was full of Edward's siblings, his father's children, all of them enslaved, all of them property. The Fairchild bloodline was tangled beyond comprehension. White and black mixed together, family and property impossible to separate. And then Edward found the entry that explained everything. The entry that explained why Vance had killed himself. It was dated 3 days before Vance's death, written in the overseer's careful hand. Discovered today the full extent of the old master's activities. Samuel is not simply the master's son. He is also the master's grandson. Ruth, Samuel's mother, was herself the old master's daughter by a woman named Celia, which means Samuel is the product of incest. The old master lying with his own daughter. The boy carries double Fairchild blood. He is both son and grandson to the same man. This explains his strong resemblance to the family. This explains why the master has always been uncomfortable around him. This explains everything. But it also means that young Thomas and Samuel are not merely uncle and nephew. They are also second cousins. The bloodlines are so tangled that I can barely trace them. How many others are there? How many other children born of these unholy unions? How deep does this corruption go? I have served this family for 8 years. I have done terrible things in their service. But I did them believing in the order of things, believing in the rightness of the system. Now I see that there is no order, no rightness. There is only corruption and lies, generation after generation. Blood mixing with blood until no one knows who they are or where they came from. God forgive me. God forgive us all. That was the last entry. 3 days later. Vance had hanged himself from the oak tree. Edward sat in his study, the journal open on his desk, and felt the world tilting around him. His father had not only fathered enslaved children. He had fathered children with his own enslaved daughter, had committed incest, had created children whose bloodlines were so tangled that they defied comprehension. Samuel was both Edward's half-brother and his nephew. Ruth had been both Edward's half-sister and Samuel's mother. The family tree was not a tree at all, but a twisted vine looping back on itself, creating connections that should never exist. And Edward himself, what was he? The son of a man who had committed unspeakable acts, the brother of people he owned, the uncle of his own brother, the master of his own family. He thought of Thomas, his son, who was beginning to understand these truths. He thought of Danina, who had asked the question that started this unraveling. He thought of all the enslaved people at Thornhill, so many of them carrying Fairchild blood, all of them trapped in this web of corruption. The system had seemed so orderly, so rational, so justified. But beneath the surface, it was chaos. It was horror. It was an abomination that corrupted everyone it touched. Edward closed the journal and sat in the darkness, drinking whiskey, trying to understand how his world had come to this. Days passed, but the weight of the discovery didn't lift from Edward's shoulders. It was as if the very air around Thornhill had grown thicker, more oppressive. The journal sat on his desk, its revelation seeping into his mind like poison, each new thought more suffocating than the last. His father's sins, once distant and almost mythical in their horror, were now tangible, real and inescapable. Edward wandered the plantation at night, the silence of the dark fields echoing the chaos inside his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Samuel, about Ruth, about the bloodlines twisted by his father's depravity. He had always known on some level that the system was unjust. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The very foundation of his life, the very soil beneath his feet, had been poisoned by lies and violence. One evening, as Edward stood at the edge of the tobacco fields, staring out into the night, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Jacob, the old man who tended the horses, his face solemn as always. Jacob was one of the few who had been there long enough to remember the old master's rule, to know the full extent of the darkness that had stained the Fairchild name. "Master," Jacob said softly, "you've been walking these fields for days. Is it the land that's weighing on you or the truth?" Edward turned, his face weary, his eyes sunken. "The truth," he whispered. "The truth about what my father did. I don't know how to live with it." Jacob nodded, his face hardening. "Ain't no easy way, master. I've seen men break under the weight of their sins, seen men try to hide from what they did, but the land always remembers. You can't run from what's in your blood." Edward's gaze shifted to the distant silhouette of the oak tree. "Vance couldn't live with it," he murmured. "And now I'm not sure I can either." "Then maybe it's time to make a choice," Jacob said, his voice low but firm. "Either live with the blood on your hands or wash them clean. But it's not just about you, master. It's about all of us." Edward turned away from Jacob's gaze, his heart heavy with regret. "How do I wash away the blood? How do I undo what's been done?" Jacob's silence was heavy, but his words carried an unexpected weight. "You can't undo it. But you can choose what comes next. You can choose who you are and who you're going to be. But the first thing you need to do is stop pretending like none of this ever happened." Edward felt a shift inside him, like a dam breaking. The pressure of years of denial finally starting to ease. The truth, though painful, had a strange kind of clarity. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just the master of Thornhill. He was a man who could see the full extent of the horror that had been built on his family's legacy. Later that evening, Edward made his way to the quarters. The enslaved people had already gathered for their evening meal, the hum of quiet conversation filling the air. He stopped at the edge of the group, watching them for a long moment before he finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," Edward began, his voice unsteady but determined. "There's no easy way to say this, but I owe it to you all to speak the truth." The group fell silent, their eyes shifting toward him. The faces of those who had worked the fields, the kitchen, the stables, people he had once seen as mere property, now seemed like people he could no longer ignore. "I've learned things," Edward continued, his voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "Things about my father, about the blood that runs through my veins and yours, and I'm ashamed. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." Danina was there, sitting at the edge of the group, her eyes watchful. When their gazes met, she knew immediately what he was going to say. She had seen the way the weight of the truth had changed him. It wasn't enough to erase the years of suffering, but it was something. It was a beginning. The next morning, Edward called for a meeting with Thomas. The boy had been quiet since the fire, withdrawn even more than usual. Edward knew he had to face his son, to explain everything before the boy made up his own mind about what to do. "Thomas," Edward said when he entered the room, "there's a lot I need to tell you. About your grandfather, about the things I've learned. You may already know some of it, but I want you to hear it from me." Thomas looked at him with cold eyes, the boy's face still bearing the mark of all he had learned in such a short time. "I don't need you to tell me," Thomas said flatly. "I know." Edward's heart sank, but he pressed on. "I've made decisions, things I can't take back. But I can try to make them right. Try to stop this madness from going any further." Thomas stood, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing to fix here, Father. There's nothing you can do to make it better. But I can." Edward blinked, stunned by the boy's words. "What do you mean?" Thomas squared his shoulders, his young voice full of a strength that surprised his father. "I'm leaving. I'm going to Richmond. I'll study, I'll become a lawyer, and I'll fight against everything we've built here. I'm not part of this. I never will be. Not anymore. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey into history. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chilling tale from America's forgotten past. Leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts on this story. And share where you're listening from! Until next time, remember history has a way of catching up with us all.